Oasis Audio presents Lethal Beauty by Lis Wiehl with April Henry. Read for you by Ashley Lawrence. Chapter 1. A faint scream drifted up from the basement. Li Hong shifted from foot to foot on the peeling linoleum, waiting in line to use the tiny bathroom. The girl named Chun bit her lip and avoided his eyes. A muscle flickered in Fang's jaw. Was it a shriek of pain, or fear, or simply a continuing protest? Ying was probably okay, Li Hong told himself. She was just getting acclimated. Life in America was not what she had expected. Ying must still be thinking that if she made enough of a fuss, things would change. That she would get what she had dreamed of. The American life, where she would drive a Mercedes and live in a big house and wear expensive clothes. What she had gotten instead was the expectation that she would work nearly 100 hours a week at a restaurant that served Chinese food, that tasted nothing like what they ate at home, and lived crammed in a small house with 18 other people. Ying had been handcuffed in the basement for refusing to work. It had been explained to her over and over, both with words and with blows. She owed a debt to the snakeheads for smuggling her over here, and her life would not be her own until she paid them back. They all owed so much. Every day simply pushed them deeper into debt. It wasn't cheap, their owner explained, to put them up in this house, drive them to work and back each day, provide them with food. So he would have to charge them for all these things. Li Hong had tried to work out the total on scraps of paper, but he had learned only a little math in his few years in school. Whatever the answer was, it was a lot. It would take years to earn back. And to make sure they all kept up their end of the bargain, they were warned that their families would be killed if they did not. None of them had known each other back home, and some of them spoke dialects that were hard for the others to follow. There was no loyalty among them. Not when whispering a secret to the owner might earn favor. Li Hong never left the house by himself. Even if he went to the store, it was part of a big group, while one of the minders watched them and translated as needed. Of course, it didn't take much watching. Not when everyone was so afraid. Hugh slipped out of the bathroom, her dark head tilted down so that her hair fell over her eyes. The bathroom didn't have a door. Just an orange window curtain tacked onto the frame to give the illusion of privacy. It was the only curtain in the house. The other windows were either bare or covered with yellowed Chinese newspapers. Chun slipped into the bathroom and they all shuffled forward. Ping took her place in line behind Li Hong. There were only 2 bathrooms, and to get to them, you had to wend your way through bunk beds filling every space. When he first came to America, Li Hong had agreed to the terms, made his mark on the paperwork, and handed over his identification. So had everyone else in the house. They all worked at the restaurant, taking orders, bussing tables, refilling pots of hot tea, or standing for hours over flaming woks. Li Hong washed dishes and sometimes cooked if they were short-handed. He was clumsy, though, and often burned himself. Li Hong had worked with Ying on her first, and so far last day. She had been filling one of the metal tea carafes with nearly boiling water when Li Hong dropped a plate that exploded into shards. She jerked at the sudden clatter. The hot water burned her forearm, immediately forming a red, fluid-filled blister. Ying had started weeping and wouldn't stop, not even when the manager came back and hissed at her that the customers could hear and were asking questions. Li Hong had tried to help her. He had taken her to the sink and run cold water over the burn, patted her shoulder awkwardly, then whispered warnings to her that she had to be quiet. Now another hoarse scream floated up. "I wish she would just shut up," Fang muttered. "It's impossible to sleep with her wailing down here." "She'd better be careful," Ping said from behind Li Hong. "There's a lot worse things she could be doing than working in a restaurant." She's not pretty enough for that, Fang sneered. I hear that the men who come don't care so much about pretty. Ping bit her lip. They could send her there as soon as her burn heals up. Another shriek. That's it, Fang balled his hands into fists. If the neighbor's here, she'll bring the police down on us, all of us rotting in prison or sent back home. The freeway is so loud, Li Hong offered, trying to placate Fang. He found he could sleep better if he thought of it as a river. It covers the sound. Fang clenched his fists. If she won't shut up on her own, I'll make her shut up. No, no, Li Hong said hastily. Let me talk to her. Abandoning his place in line, he went back down the hall. When he ducked under the rope hung with drying laundry, a pair of damp pants slapped him in the face. In the kitchen, he washed out a glass and filled it with water. The basement stairs were next to the back door. On the door was posted a sign handwritten in Chinese. Employees, pay attention. Turn light out at 12. Please don't yell, talk loud, or make noise because it will disturb the neighbors. Li Hong would be fine with disturbing the neighbors if he thought they might help. That was all he thought about now. How to get out of this place, this position he was in, before he was an old man. To make it so that the enforcers would leave him in peace, or at least not know his whereabouts. He had thought of asking the people at the nearby businesses if they could help him get away. They came in to eat. It would not be hard to slip away and talk to them for a few minutes. But his English was very poor, and they were all friendly with the owner, and he bought them meals. Li Hong knew what would happen if he asked a policeman. Beaten, maybe killed, or at best, jailed and then deported. The owner had explained it often. Just thinking about it made him long for a cigarette to calm his nerves, but he had smoked the last one from his pack today. Cigarettes were so expensive, costing nearly as much as the owner gave him in a day. But they blunted his hunger, tamped down his anxiety. It was a cigarette that had led Li Hong to his one hope, a man he called Mr. Scott. They weren't allowed breaks, but sometimes, when it was slow, he would slip out the back door and smoke for 5 minutes. A few months earlier, Li Hong had gone outside with a cigarette already between his lips. But in the spot where he normally stood was a white American man, smoking. Li Hong had started to hurry back inside, but with gestures and smiles and words he didn't understand, Mr. Scott had indicated that he should stay. After exchanging names, they had smoked their cigarettes together. When Mr. Scott was finished, he had unwrapped a stick of gum that stank of chemicals and mint, then chewed it furiously. The whole time he talked, first asking Li Hong questions that he could only answer with a smile and a shrug. Eventually, it became a monologue that hadn't seemed to require anything from Li Hong but an occasional nod. Mr. Scott was well-dressed, his clothes fitting him without a wrinkle, the stitching in the fabric very fine. And later, Li Hong had seen him getting into his car. It was huge and shiny and raised high off the ground, without a single scratch or dent. Mr. Scott was like a vision of the America that Li Hong had thought he was coming to. Maybe this was the sign he had been hoping for. The next time Li Hong saw him, Mr. Scott asked, with a combination of words and gestures, for a cigarette. Despite the cost, Li Hong handed it over without hesitation. Mr. Scott grimaced at the taste, and they had laughed, and somehow through the few words they had in common, they started to become something like friends. Whenever he came to the restaurant, Mr. Scott would talk, long runs of words that flowed past Li Hong like water. They were oddly soothing. The fourth time he saw Mr. Scott, Li Hong tried to ask for help, using words he had gleaned from TV. But then Mr. Scott had so many questions. He had asked about minimum wage, about sick leave, and health insurance. Words and concepts that Li Hong didn't understand. You worked every day, from 10 in the morning to 10 or 11 p.m. You worked if you were sick or hurt or exhausted. You would probably still work, they often joked, if you were dead. And before Mr. Scott could help them, he had been killed in a car accident. A few months later, his wife had come to the restaurant. Li Hong had been overjoyed. He thought she must be there to follow up on Mr. Scott's promise. But when he risked everything to ask her, she seemed not to understand. Later, she had come back with a magic phone that understood them both and translated from English to Chinese and back again. They hadn't gotten very far when the owner came out back and nearly caught them. He hadn't seen the woman he called Mrs. Scott since, but he had seen the concern in her eyes, the caring. He was sure she would help if she knew what was happening. Now Li Hong's hand was slick on the stair rail. If the owner knew he was coming down here. In the basement, Yang sat with her back against the wall. One arm was handcuffed to a pipe. The other had been roughly bandaged, although the once white wrapping was now stiff and dirty. Her face was swollen, her eyes so puffy she could barely see. Li Hong put the glass of water in her free hand. She gulped it down greedily, and then he took the glass back. The last girl who had been put down there had tried to kill herself. "You have to stop crying," he told her in a low but firm voice. "Stop shrieking, stop crying, apologize, and start working. My whole village saved up to send me here. This is not what I thought it would be." Bitterness welled up in him. "Do you think it was for any of us? Besides, do you know what they'll do if you keep this up? You'll end up in a massage parlor or nail shop." She shook her head. "But I don't know how to give massage or do nails." The girl was as stupid as she was stubborn. "That doesn't matter. You won't be doing either of those things. You'll be entertaining 3 or 4 men an hour, 14 hours a day." The one eye that wasn't quite as bruised widened. "Please, you have to help me. You have to save me." She raised the bandaged arm toward him, the one that had burned when he dropped the plate. Li Hong still had the small white cardboard rectangle that Mrs. Scott had given him. The printing on it seemed to be letters and numbers, and he was nearly certain it held her address. He would go there, he decided, with a sudden surge of fear and daring. He would go there, and she would use her magic phone, and they would understand each other. And then she would help free Ying from the dark basement, help free Li Hong from his days spent as a slave.